testing. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you could make it here, bus snafu notwithstanding. I'm very sorry for that, and thank you so much for those of you who just took the initiative and walked here, or Ubered here, or whatever you did. I'm sorry that it messed up the schedule, and let's just say we will be having words with the bus company. So, HASTAC 2017, we started off in a different location, as you probably know, and then nature intervened. I'm not going to give you the entire sordid saga, but once we... This is not working. There we go. Once we realized that the possible world that we had become all too real, we decided to add a little bit of that reality to our logo. So there we have it. Irma exists in all possible worlds. And so I'm not, you know about the theme already. I'm going to try and make it through all of this as quickly as possible because we want to give the maximum amount of time for our very exciting opening plenary panel. I do want to mention, though, that this is being sponsored or presented to you by the Florida Digital Humanities Consortium. It's a group of a dozen schools, a dozen programs that from across the state that have formed in the last few years to try and address issues connected to digital humanities. And so this is one of the major events that collectively the group has put on. As you know, you're here at UCF, and so the Center for Humanities and Digital Research is the local host, along with the College of Arts and Humanities. Some conference housekeeping things, just very quickly. There's a conference website. I'm sure you all know about it. The schedule is on that website, both in static form and in interactive form. It's formatable for mobile devices and all of that sort of thing, so please take a look at that. There's a Facebook page, Twitter. There's a hashtag that we're using throughout the conference, so if you want to use that as you do social media, that'd be great. There is a Wi-Fi, dedicated Wi-Fi for the conference. Yes, it does work. Yesterday we had some snafus with that too, but now it works. So there's the password, and it should be very fast and very reliable. I've logged on and it does seem to work. So please write that down or take a picture of it or whatever, and you will be able to have Wi-Fi. I'm just pausing for a moment while people take pictures of it. Very good. Very good. I see the cameras are almost done. Okay, here we go. Moving on. So if you need people to help, to direct you to places, to help you with the schedule, whatever, obviously I can help with that. My name is Bruce Jans. Amy Giroux can help with that. She is the managing director of the conference. She's standing right over there. She is wearing one of our very lovely t-shirts. Look for those t-shirts, and anyone wearing that t-shirt can help you as well. And you may have run into Phil Peters. He is out where the bus comes in, and he can also help you as well. Also, really anyone from UCF, we're going to conscript them into helping you as well. They don't know that yet, but there you go. So some very quick information. There are gender neutral bathrooms, but not in this building. In the next building, Classroom 2 building. If you want to use a gender-neutral bathroom, there's one there. There's also one in the theater building beside visual arts. Lunch is at Nitro's, and you will see this very lovely thing that you got in the when you registered here is our little map, right? Which also doubles as a screen cleaner. Very practical. So everything that you need to know is pretty much on this map, and so you can see where Nitro's is. You will have received a lunch ticket for today and tomorrow for that, so you can go there for lunch. If you don't want to go there for lunch, there are other places you can go to buy lunch in the Student Union or beside the arena. There are a number of places, so there's lots of different options for food. There's breakfast and breaks in 220 in this building and also some in the visual arts building. And the shuttles, we may have to amend that, obviously. They're going to be on task now, the shuttles. Let me just say that. Riot acts are going to be read. Okay, there's some merch. We'll just zip right by that. Just want to mention safety. Some of you who walked this morning will recognize that you were walking over some very busy roads where people drive quickly. Please, please, please be careful as you cross those roads. You know, it's only a 20-minute walk. It's not that far, but you know, just make sure that you're looking all ways. Program highlights. We are going to try and keep on task as much as possible. The panel this morning is supposed to go to 9:45. We're going to stretch that a little bit as much as possible to give them the maximum amount of time. But the next panel is supposed to start at 10 o'clock. You will see in the schedule quite a number of parallel panels. Today, the panels are scattered between this building and the Nicholson School of Communication, and some in the psychology building in the philosophy department, which is in the psychology building. Don't get me started on that. And some other places as well. You can see when lunch is. You can see that after 4:45 this afternoon, you can also go over and see posters, project demos, media art, media installations over in the visual art building. Which is on your map here as well. And there's lots and lots of great stuff. Many of you have brought some really incredible things. So we're looking forward to seeing that. Tomorrow, there will be an actual poster session where the people who made the posters will be there to discuss them with you. That's at 11:15 to 12:15. Forgot to mention this evening, there is a reception, 7 to 9. You would have received a drink ticket for that at registration. That is in the Fairwinds Alumni Center. It's just kind of down the sidewalk here, very close. 7 to 9, we've got a great jazz band. We've got a very, very short program and some great food, so please come to that. And then tomorrow, after the various parallel sessions, we have a closing keynote that runs from 4:30 to 6 with Kathy Davidson and Julie Thompson-Klein, after which there will be a book signing of Kathy's new book. So that's the kind of overview of the schedule, and you can check online for details on that in the programs and abstracts. You'll notice the Hack the Abstracts project outside. Many of you made the 1-minute videos, and thank you for that. And if you miss something, you can just kind of walk by and just watch them go. You might find something interesting that you didn't even know about. Posters and media, we talked about that. Just where the buildings are, I think you have that on your little map here. You can see I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. So, finally, we are at our plenary panel. And I am not going to do much of an introduction because they're going to do their own introductions. I will say, however, that the moderator of the panel is our own Anastasia Salter, Assistant Professor of Digital Media here at UCF. So, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to hand it over to the panel.
Good morning. So, we're going to start things off in the spirit of HASTAC with a conversation. So I'd like to begin by just asking the panel if you could say a bit about who you are, what you're working on, and how you fit or don't fit into the space of digital humanities and HASTAC. Would you like to start us off?
Sure.
Okay.
My name is TK Sangwand. I'm a librarian, an archivist, and an occasional DJ. And what my work focuses on is working with cultural heritage institutions in the Global South to build capacity so that they can preserve and provide access to their own cultural heritage and have the agency in the retelling of their own historical narratives. I've been working in this field for the past 8 years. I was previously at the University of Texas at Austin's Human Rights Documentation Initiative, where we partnered with organizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the US to preserve their documentation and provide access to that. And that took various forms depending on the capacity and resources of that institution. And currently I'm at UCLA working on a project called the International Digital Ephemera Project. I lead all of our initiatives in Cuba, and we're doing various projects from collaborating with the National Library to digitize historic periodicals, to doing more grassroots community-oriented oral history project with the Chinese Cuban community, as well as a Cuban hip-hop archive.
You have such cool work.
So I'm Purdom Lindblad. I'm the Assistant Director of Innovation and Learning, and don't know how to use a microphone, at MITH, which is the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. Did I do it? Okay. Can you hear me? Kind of, okay. lean in. Is that what I'm saying? Okay. Okay. So my work at Myth is looking at how to turn what is historically a research institute, a digital humanities research institute, into a space that's also engaged in teaching and learning. And so I'm thinking about how to introduce digital humanities to undergraduates, to graduate students, and then also to faculty. And part of my work at Myth involves two projects. One is the African American Digital Humanities and Cultures Project, which is we acronymed as ADHUM. And that involves like both thinking about like networking a community of scholars who are involved in digital studies who identify as Black Studies scholars or African Americanists, rather than centering the technology. So the sort of first is how do we engage in Black voices? How do we engage in the Black experience? And then in what ways does the digital give us a platform to do that in better ways or more interesting ways? The second project that I'm working on is called Advocacy by Design with my colleague at the Scholars Lab, Jeremy Boggs. And that's invested in thinking about feminist interface design and what are the principles of feminism, such as stewardship or polyvocalism, that we can take and implement into the interface. And what does that mean in terms of our transparency and our care of the materials that we are charged with preserving, and then also the people whose stories are embedded in those materials. So those are the two main things that I've been working on lately.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Hi. I am Tressie McMillan Cottom, and I'm assistant professor of sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University. And although they don't pay me, they would really like me to also say that I'm a faculty associate at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. So I will say that too. How do I fit into this conversation? I may not. I am, again, a sociologist. But I tend to study the context within which digital humanities has become an interdisciplinary discipline, a center, a program, an institute, and a network scholarship program, depending on one's perspective. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what I am working on right now. Several things. So the first is at VCU. I'm the faculty co-founder of our digital sociology graduate program. It's the first in the US. We hope it is certainly not the last. And we study questions broadly about how digital technology shapes social processes and social processes and kinds shape digital technologies. Based on my personal interest in research agenda, that means we look a lot at things like race, class, and gender, the structuration of the social processes that allow some people to participate in different sorts of activities in the modern society differently. I also think a lot about how we do our academic work in this context. So we're thinking a lot about methods, dissemination, sort of ownership and sharing. What does open science and open data mean within the context of, one, the political economy of how higher education works now? So what does it mean to be trying to do this sort of innovative digital work in a way that may or may not reproduce the very power structures that many of us are interested in critiquing? And that informs my second project, the thing that I'm sort of turning my focus to right now, which we are now tentatively calling the Du Boisian Center for the Study of Black Life in the Digital Society. And so this is ideally a network of scholars who are thinking about the spirit of Du Boisian sociology, which is centering sort of the Black Liberation Project, but also a critical analysis of the political economy of a society. And we're thinking about, what does it mean? What does Black life mean? Life chances, quality of life in a digital society. My students and I are working on a range of things related to that. So what do Black feminist discourses look like? What sort of platform affordances allow and disallow certain types of engagement online? But we're also looking at how people are using technology in sort of their daily interactions with trying to access critical institutional resources like work, education, health, housing, transportation. We're starting that by looking at some of the minority communities in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I'm located, and and we're building a cohort now of people that we're following across a couple of different social domains. And so that's what I'm working on.
So it strikes me kind of listening to the different types of engagement that you all have with particularly the assumptions of the digital and the inherent race, class, and gender assumptions embedded in so many of these systems, that this is a good opportunity to think about this tension between digital and digital humanities, and particularly how often that goes uninterrogated. So I don't know if you've all seen the recent Chronicle of Higher Education articles debating the status of the digital humanities, as apparently we must do every few months. But kind of considering that, and particularly considering this changing landscape of the discourse of feminist interfaces and awareness, do you see kind of digital humanities as a useful space for this conversation, or is it perhaps time for a new term or an interrogation of the assumptions behind the term digital humanities?
I feel wrong as a sociologist starting on that. I mean, clearly I've got a position, but as an interloper, I'm probably not supposed to start. So, please.
I also feel like I'm on the peripheries of the digital humanities, so you can take that as you want. I mean, I see my work related to digital humanities in the sense that the materials that we work with our partners to make digital, we hope can be the basis for humanities or digital humanities scholarship. As someone who's on the periphery, as an archivist, I've definitely watch the archival turn in the humanities with interest. I think there's a lot of interesting critique, important critique that a lot of archivists are making. I think what troubles me is the tendency to want to engage with the quote-unquote archive without engaging with actual archivists and their praxis. I think when there's a discussion about the quote-unquote the archive, it's often thought about in monolithic terms, and there are many different types of archives, and there are many people working within archives that are resisting or subverting the dominant power structures that people typically associate with archives. I want to point to one example that I find particularly inspiring. It's an organization that I used to work with when I was at the Human Rights Documentation Initiative. It's the Texas After Violence Project, and they're a community-based archive that conducts oral histories with people who've been impacted by the death penalty. So this means people, family and friends of murder victims, of people who've been on death row, lawyers, media witnesses, anti-death penalty activists, and all of this is to help facilitate a dialogue of the impact of capital punishment at all these different levels within Texas. So I think that's a great example of how archives can really subvert these dominant power structures and really help us imagine, worlds without violence. I think there are also amazing archivists who are doing this work. Michelle Caswell is, of course, a really important example. She came out with a great article on how to dismantle white supremacy in archives, some really concrete actions that archivists can do within their own institutions. There's also people like Elvio Arroyo, Jennifer O'Neill, who does a lot of work with Indigenous archives, Jarrett Drake, of course, Talia Cooper, who works at The Intercept and does a lot of work around privacy and access to government information. So I think there's a lot of examples within the archival field that we can look to and that digital humanities scholars can look to, because we're also making similar critiques and having discourse that I think would be of interest to folks in these other fields.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I too am an archivist, but I also have identified as a digital humanist since I was a grad student working at Matrix at Michigan State. And so I kind of sit at the intersections of this space and have found the archival critique on both humanist understanding of what an archive actually is, and then what are the responsibilities therein to the materials and to the people who are created within it, or whose stories are represented within it. And thinking about whether the digital humanities is the term. I mean, in a sense, because I have been a part of the community and these debates, that in a sense, the name is extremely important. At the same time, it really can be exclusionary. And my work with AdHum has been a prime example of this, because the idea is to network and then engage students and scholars who are working within Black Studies who are thinking about the digital. And when we were assembling the team, so there are 2 postdocs, 3 GAs, and then the director is Catherine Knight Steele, and then MITH staff. And the idea of like who the right people are to like create the sort of foundational space for having a discussion on campus about Black digital studies, turns out that if you front the technology, you really don't end up with the right people. If you front the questions of like, are you committed to thinking about the scope and the structure of power and the sort of institutions and infrastructures that create, dominant narratives. And if we want to dismantle those things, we really needed people. The right people tended to be the people who focused on that in their work. And so we ended up with folks from communications. We have a woman who, even now, a year in, refuses to identify as a digital scholar. She studies Black love. That's what she does. And she's incredible. And she's one of the best voices on the AdHum team, in part because, I'm really not good with microphones. So she's one of the best people on the AdHum team because she always brings us back. Like, how does that digital technology, how does that interface, how does this approach actually affect our question of representing the Black experience? And so I think to TK's point, like there's a great deal that archivists can lend in terms of like our naming strategies and metadata, which I know puts a lot of humanists to sleep, but there's a great deal of like power claims when you're naming something, as well as scholars who don't identify as the digital, but can help bring a deep critique of how the digital then shapes what kinds of stories we're able to tell.
Yeah, again, it may not be fair for me to have any opinion on this whatsoever, but that has never stopped me before. So as I understand the recent conversation, and again, I think I've been through, which is really interesting, I've probably been through maybe 4 of these cycles. I think the first time was in graduate school, and it was, digital humanities is the end all, be all, and then it was going to be the end of it all. And so I've been through, and then I sat out a few of them because I was busy, everybody else was busy, and there were new graduate students come behind you who need to fight that fight, and so we move on. But I did catch this most recent one, right? Conversation in the Chronicle, which, by the way, is paired with this huge profile of Frank Moretti in the New York Times the next day, right? And I suspect that's part of the same conversation and same push. So I think this is interesting. My understanding of it as someone who does study institutions, does study higher education, so that it's important to maybe know that that's my lens, is that there is a difference between digital humanities, the institution building, and digital humanities, the community, right? I very rarely see the community that of many people that I know and have been working with now for several years reflected in the sort of mass media and sort of institutional level discussions about what is digital humanities, right? And I just think that's an ongoing tension. I suspect that the longevity of the conversations that happen in digital humanities will be more grounded in community than it will be in institution building. I don't think digital humanities, for example, lives and dies on whether or not Frank Moretti convinces us to do distant reading, right? I suspect that what the actual contribution to the overall discourse of what digital humanities will do will be that it created a space for those in the academy and academy adjacent to reimagine ways of doing the work that we do. Now, so let me tell you how I think about digital humanities and how it's informed my work. I've said many times as I kind of go around talking to people about building the digital sociology program, that for us, digital humanities was and continues to be a critical point of comparison, a touchstone for how we are going to build the program, right? So I think we've learned from some of the debates in digital humanities, and we certainly hope that we will continue to learn those lessons. And one of those primary lessons for me was to start with, I love this point, was to start with not centering what was digital about what we were doing, right? My experience was that when we did that, what we ended up with were technologists, as opposed to, at the start of any sort of knowledge production process, you generally, it's the one time I think you need the philosophers first, right? If you're gonna build something that has resonance and that is resilient. And I thought that we were we risked if we centered digital too early, and my experience with digital humanities suggested that if we did that and didn't instead lead with the philosophy of learning, teaching, and researching, that really it would be very easy for the program to be co-opted for the sort of political and economic interests of the institution. Right, that's gonna happen anyway. Let me just be clear about that. There's only so much resistance we can do, but if you were going to have any counterweight to that, if we were gonna have any check on how that was going to happen, that we had to start with the philosophy of what we were doing as opposed to the tools of what we were doing. I'm actually fundamentally disinterested in tools as an object of study, and that's just me, but I am interested in how people use them and think about them. And one of the things that I had gotten from the community of DH was that is also, I think, where the most energy is, thinking about those things more broadly and deeply. The rest of it, the tools and all of that, is what the institution is usually invested in. It's what gives us the political capital and cover to do our work. And there's certainly, I think, value in having someone who can speak that language and do that work. But I am always very cautious about the fact that I assume most of those public debates about what is digital humanities, has it failed, is it a thing, is really talking about that. It's talking about that institutional stuff. I don't think that fundamentally communities and networks can fail. Those are people. People can't, I mean, what, people fail at being people? I don't even know what that is, right? So, so I think those are two entirely different things. Now, the more practical concerns of whether or not I think the digital humanities is still a useful heuristic is interesting. If it is something that people are claiming for themselves, I don't know that it matters whether or not we think it's useful. If we believe in what we say we believe in, which is agency and people building things, then I'm not sure that it's even a debate we could be having. If people call themselves that and they are organizing under that banner, then it's useful because the people say that it is. Now, is institutionalized digital humanities useful? Now, that's an entirely different conversation.
Okay, it's interesting. We've now kind of talked about digital humanities at the level of an identity, at the level of a community, and of course the level of institutional practice. And the one that tends to attract the most attention and discourse, of course, is the level of the institution and those frameworks that grants all of those driving forces within the profession. But just a quick poll for the audience. Who here identifies as a digital humanist?
And there you go.
So, there we go. Not many of us up on the panel, but a better percentage out in the room. And when we frame kind of the digital humanities as an identity and as part of how we relate to each other as scholars, that might be a useful entry point into this year's theme of the possible worlds of digital humanities. So how do you see kind of yourself in these projects you've discussed as kind of intersecting with this question of the possible worlds of the digital humanities? And what are the possible worlds that you'd like to see emerge?
Go ahead.
So, I'm just going to give it up.
I was going to say, we may.
It's over. It's over. So one of the things that I've been sitting with for about a year now, maybe a little less, is Rosie Warren is an editor of a journal called Salvage. And the 4th issue sort of letter from the editors has a sentence in it that says, the infrastructures against social misery have yet to be built. And I think that given a space that we term both as an identity and as like a professional identity, but also a networked community, I think that digital humanities gives us a lens to begin to identify, articulate what those structures of social misery currently are, and then begin to assemble the tools to dismantle them, as well as to begin to imagine new ways of being together, being as scholars, being as people, and then also of building those new kinds of infrastructures. I mean, one of the things that I think I came into the digital humanities at a point which really enabled me to talk about like how the digital inscribes and reinforces white supremacy in such a way that I don't think I would have been able to see the power that I had to understand the tools in a way and then to modify them and take them down. So a lot of the work with AdHum is to teach people, collaboratively teach people, what kinds of tools are available, what kinds of arguments the technology is actually making, and then how to then bend that technology to either expose those assumptions or to change them. And so last semester we did a great deal of work with like mapping and sort of spatial work in AdHum. And so we talked a lot about like what kinds of arguments are maps making, and then what kinds of arguments can you then expose in terms of boundary setting and policing, surveillance and privacy. And so in addition to kind of talking about like the technical aspects of how to build a map, we also ended up talking about like things that end up making my archivist heart very, very happy. Like, are we supposed to be collecting these materials? And are these stories of these communities meant to be shared beyond that particular community, and in what way? And then what are the technical affordances of the kinds of tools that we're using that can protect people as well as share those narratives? So I do think that, in a way, the ability to kind of claim a space, in a sense, like this is a digital humanities argument, and I have a community who is committed to thinking about things like racism and structures of power and sexism, and that gives me a better space to kind of like point to other scholars who are doing this work.
You know, when I think about the possibility angle, which I actually think about a lot lately, I'm reading a lot of, I have all my life, but I'm rereading a lot of like Afrofuturism right now, and getting back in touch with the literature and English side of my background, because I think I clearly think stories matter. And I was starting to worry that I only knew how to tell the story of oppression at some point, and I wanted to make sure I still knew how to tell a different story. So I'm working on that. So I don't have a clear-cut answer for that, and that was probably way too much divulging of my personal problems right now. But I've been thinking about that for a while. So I would like to tell you, so what my grand vision of what are the possible worlds when I think about technology, I can tell you what I hope we're doing in my program, and just more broadly what I hope I'm doing in a community of people. And that is this: I want to help produce almost quite literally an army of people who know how to think about and use technology critically, and who will go out into the world and do it in spaces that we never imagined them doing it in. I want critical thinkers of technology working at your bank. I want critical thinkers of technology working at your local social service agency. I want them in service work. I want them in community work. And there's a reason why I want that. I think that the networks of technology and people who are able to legitimately be technologists in our culture has, of course, become a stand-in for all kinds of other relationships of domination and oppression. And I think part of that being a functional position in our society is that we have decided that technology is something for specialists, right? Yeah. And see, and I think that the moment that something becomes the work of specialists, it becomes a tool of defining who does not have legitimate access to controlling their own health and well-being, right? I want the people that I am working with, the students that I'm teaching, the colleagues that I'm working with, I want them to be able to think about and do technology in a way that upends the idea that it is only for special people who do a special kind of thinking and a special kind of tinkering. And that is because technology has too much of a direct and indirect impact right now on how we live our lives for it to remain an area of expertise. So I want to completely delegitimize it as a form of expertise, which seems a weird goal since I'm building institution, but that's just the way it goes. You got to have a launch pad, and that's mine right now. And so that's sort of the big goal, right? That's sort of my personal goal. I want us to be able to reorganize our relationship to technology, and fundamentally, hopefully, reorganize our relationship to understanding the difference between our work and having meaning, and to hopefully reorganize our institutions and our lives around meaning as opposed to work. In the interim, though, we got to deal with how we work and how we do that work. And so my sort of short-term or more intermediate musings about the possible worlds of thinking critically and sort of running what I call is, running the underground railroad of critical thinking beneath these institutional banners, which I learned from my HBCU. This is how you do. You let them call you whatever you want, and then you teach whatever you want, okay? And so you constantly are running this career. Yeah, I know. So some of my former professors here in the room, everybody say hi to Collie. So that was for her from my historically black college, University of North Carolina Central Resort. Hey, Col. All right. So this is our culture, and this is what I know how to do. And so part of that in the intermediate is building this sort of underground railroad of how do we build a critical discipline beneath the banner of the institutional discipline that we need in the short term to provide us basically the capital, if you want to be honest, to do that work. I want to make engaging with technology something that people think about as being somehow both their individual responsibility, but also a public problem of responsibility. And I mean, that's tough, right? But I want people to not think of technology as something that you touch or buy, but something that you absolutely have to engage with in your individual life, but that the way that you engage with it is a public problem that you don't have to deal with as a private problem to how you manage your life. How do we get there? And imagining that is, I do think, one of the great challenges for us as so much of, again, my work is about documenting how that goes wrong. That trying to create the space of writing better stories. And so increasingly I'm looking at like some of my colleagues who do things like the sociology of fiction and the importance of sort of narratives in structuring how we do understand social science and how we do what we do, mostly because I do think we have to get a placeholder for that in our daily work.
So when I think about different worlds, I think a lot about how we can make archival practice more liberatory. I think we understand how archives have historically collected histories of those who have been in power or who've been considered to be culturally relevant or worthy of scholarly inquiry. And so, of course, the scholarship around these people have reified those power relations. Working at UT and now working at UCLA, I've been thinking a lot about how can we leverage the institution's resources and redistribute them to our partners in the Global South who haven't had access to those resources, and particularly in the case of Cuba because of US foreign policy with Cuba, right? So just to give you an example, really basic archival supplies such as folders and boxes are already pretty expensive here in the US, but Cubans really don't have access to it because of the embargo. It's prohibitively expensive for them to buy from Europe, and they can't get things shipped from the US. So the idea of preservation in Cuba is, I think, inherently political, as it is here. So the model that we've been working with is really trying to build capacity with the organizations in the Global South. We bring down equipment, we do training on site. I think it's really important that this happens on site with our partners as opposed to having them come to the US for that training, just because we're able to account for local circumstances and really understand the context in which they're working. I think it's also really important to train the people there and have that knowledge be distributed among all the staff and not just a select few that can come to the US and can get those visas or speak English or what have you. So, you know, this isn't a perfect model. There's still a lot of institutional pressure on the US side to work on our own timelines, or our agreements are all written in English, and it's been, I've been struggling, you know, to get them translated, and even to have staff go down who have the expertise to do training in Spanish, that sort of thing. So it's not a perfect model, but I think we're getting away, or we're starting to question and give concrete examples of what it looks like, not just to collect materials from the Global South and extract it from the communities where they're based, but really working with folks there so that they can preserve their own histories. And because they're really the experts in their own histories. This was super evident in the work that we did in Rwanda, where the Kigali Genocide Memorial has been collecting oral histories with survivors of the genocide. And so we at UT had the digital copies, but the Genocide Memorial, retained the original copies, and they did all the metadata on site, which was far more effective than us trying to find people in Texas who speak Kinyarwanda and could actually, deeply understand the materials. So that's one example. And I think over the years of working with the Genocide Memorial, they began to be recognized as archival leaders within the country, and they were later contracted by the government to do archival assessments at that level. So I think that's a really great example of how important it is to invest with the partners locally, and that way, they can start building that expertise on the ground and not be so dependent on expertise here in the US or in other Western countries. Getting to that idea of how it's really important to critique expertise and who's considered experts, I think this model that we're working with is really trying to recognize the expertise locally, both the deep subject expertise, the language expertise, and getting away from archivists as the sole gatekeepers of this knowledge.
Can I add to that? So both of your points remind me of because part of AdHum does do technical training. Like we actually do teach people how to make a map or mark up a document in TEI. And rather than starting with the assumption that there is one expert, a TEI expert in the room, what we try to do is center a way that people have engaged with a kind of practice. Like people have used maps, like how to use a map. And so how do we then draw out the critical skills that are already existing in the room so that people feel more confident in beginning to say, all right, I can see how this skill set of my critique can then influence how I might build a particular map. So that we honor the technical expertise in the room, but we don't center it. So we center other people's expertise and like what they're bringing to this particular session, whether that's a research question, whether that's a different take on a technical aspect of building a map or working with TEI. So I think that it is not necessarily decentralizing expertise, but it's like raising up the varieties of expertises that exist within a digital project, particularly around a really complex research project. Yeah, so that's what I'll say.
So you've all evoked some of the specters of the major problems hanging over culture and academia, of course, white supremacy, technological specialization, and what happens when certain systems are perhaps not clear to users, particularly in the algorithms by which information is sorted and displayed. And we have all of that hanging over this conversation of possible worlds. And of course, the flip side of this theme is the hardest problems facing digital humanities and the academic community right now. So I'd like to ask first what you see as the hardest problem we're facing and the one that's kind of most important for us to tackle as a community.
I'm nervous now. I mean, and personally, I'm speaking just for me. I think that the biggest problem in the academy is what Tressie points to. Like, when we start to consider people as capital, our priorities are completely wrong. When we consider profit and materials as significant, then we go down the wrong path almost immediately. If we recenter what's significant is on people and on the relationships and the networks in which we are working within, then I think it helps us begin to articulate what needs to be dismantled and what then can be rebuilt. But I think a lot of this is in terms of revealing assumptions of graduate student labor, of contract labor, thinking about what kinds of support are available for archivists, librarians, staff for research time. How do we demystify the process of doing research in a digital way? And then how do we then scaffold an experience that people can then bring their own expertise into this? So I think that the biggest problem is that our priorities are wrong in a sense, and I think that in a way it can't be a top-down flipping of that. Capital is dead, it's not living, right? People are living, animals are living, our planet, although we're killing it, is living, and so our priorities have to be there. And that's a community thing, I think. And it translates into things like conference codes of conduct. It translates into like bringing undergraduates to a conference and naming them as your collaborators. Working with archives and with libraries, because there's a deep set of knowledge bases there that don't seep into departments easily. It's sort of like a single ambassador. They're like, oh, there's a librarian who does this thing, and you can join them. And the librarians are like, please come to us. So I think there's like walls that can be opened in a real way that is not necessarily at the sort of like height of like, let's dismantle white supremacy, as like, which I think we should, that is like our job, right?
But maybe not Tuesday at 2.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, and Dr. Howard, who is the former director of the Schomburg Center, I couldn't decide whether it was heartburn or optimism. It was, like, he said, and I swear to you, I like gasped at the time, he said, America is a social justice project, that it's like long-term, and you don't have to do it Tuesday at 2. This is like a long-term thing. You pick up your piece and you run, and when you're tired, put it down, and then somebody else will pick it back up, and just empower the people around you to pick it up. So it's like starting small and kind of growing, and it's never done, but.
Yeah, so what is you asked the sociologist, what is our biggest problem? Yeah. And you already covered it, capitalism. There you go. That's always the short. That'll do. That's the first thing you learn your first week of graduate school. If you say capitalism is the problem, you can contribute to the class discussion. But
how do you do that?
Yeah,
exactly.
So let's see. So not beyond that, but within that, I guess is what I will say. I think we're in this moment, and you're probably going to hear a lot of this. I know you're going to hear from Kathy's talk and all the talks around, which is we know what our big problem is. We don't know what we're supposed to be doing right now, right? The problem is, while that is our problem, it's not necessarily just our problem. So we need all of these other people to solve our problem, which is often the problem, right? We can't just reinvent ourselves without the public trust and investment of all kinds of other groups of people. That's our problem. Like, right, if you got us all together and we just could control the institutions we work in, and we could control the way we do work, that would be a different scale of problem. Our issue is our problems rely so much on other types of problems, right? It is, the definition of a wicked problem. One of those where the more you poke at it, the more you try to unravel it, the more problems you produce, right? But I don't think that's not a reason to sort of throw our hands up. In fact, the being in a moment where almost everything about the way we work is being questioned and being held up to examination. We're constantly now being asked to justify our work and justify it in ways both familiar to us and strange to us. And sometimes being asked to justify our work in ways that we are never going to be able to satisfy. Right? A lot of what's being asked of us just simply cannot be done. But here's what I think is amazing. We're not the only ones having that problem, right? All of our social institutions are undergoing that problem. But unlike some of the other social institutions, by definition, the work we do is community-based. We don't always remember that. We don't always have the tools to live it and make it our daily practice. But if we know anything from the great story of graduate student seminars that the problem is always capitalism, it is this, that community is the antidote to alienation, right? All kinds of other social institutions are going to have to figure out community. At least we know how to do that. We may not always be functional at it, but we do know how to do it. And so I think the big problem of what we're supposed to be doing, which is justifying ourselves, et cetera, we actually already kind of know how to solve that. Which is, the problem is that there's so many incentives for us to not think of it that way. That if we could just chase a little bit more prestige, if we could just chase a little bit more grant money, right, et cetera, and and all of that is just diminishing returns, right? When in fact the doubling down on community is really right now the only value proposition we have. And so I think the grand immediate problem, but site of opportunity for us is to double down on the one thing that we can do best and that we know how to do best, and that is sort of building community. And across all of those sort of institution boundaries, which, listen, I know that's, we always say that, right? And we talk about interdisciplinarity and getting across hierarchies and across job role and job function, and then we're all going to go to work next week and not do that, right? Because it is hard. But I think it is the most amenable hard part of the wicked problem, right? That's the part that doesn't require like burning down anything. That's actually the thing we maybe can do Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Mm-hmm. That does have this sort of longer range impact. And so, yeah, a big problem is that in the chase for trying to justify ourselves, I think we'll give up the very justification for ourselves. Right, the more we chase institutionalizing ourselves and chasing money and chasing our sort of direct economic value, that we will give up and exchange the very thing that is, I think, our only value proposition, which is that we do more than that.
Well, I definitely agree with what everyone has said here so far. In the library information science archives field, I do think it is necessary to articulate again and again that capitalism and white supremacy are the root problems that we're facing in terms of, how we think about funding, how we think about labor, how we think about the design of the technology that we're utilizing. Unfortunately, in our graduate seminars in library school, that actually isn't the common point of discussion or like the entry point of discussion.
We should get together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really reflected, in the leadership or lack thereof of a lot of library institutions, that there isn't that fundamental understanding of how the systemic forms of oppression really play into the work that we do and how our work reifies those systems as well. So I think, education and within, our field is really important around that, and modeling what sort of new ways of being in this profession is very important for the graduate students that we work with.
And to second that, I think one of the most transformative articles that I've read in the last 5 years is Beth Sadler and Chris Borg's feminist interface. It's basically feminism and library interfaces. How do we think about, how do we expose to library users what the assumptions are behind the search algorithms? So when you search in this seemingly neutral space of the library's database, what you get back is not neutral at all. And librarians, as TK has mentioned, they're not trained well to think about what they do in terms of naming. And how that naming then allows what can then be known. So the metadata essentially is the tag that allows your articles to come up. So if you search, let me back up. One of my projects is Advocacy by Design, and it started with an archive, a public archive called Take Back the Archive, because UVA had a major sexual assault accusation, and the fallout from that was an ever-rising, we didn't know that sexual violence happened at University of Virginia, which was just flatly unbelievable, that there is this institutional cycle of forgetting, and that sexual assault has happened at UVA since 1854 and has been documented as such. And so the Scholars Lab, where I was at the time, has started an archive with Lisa Goff, who's a faculty member in American Studies and in English. And the goal of the archive was to collect all of the materials that documented this long history, both of activism and of violence on campus. What emerged out of this is that the ways in which people who have experienced sexual violence talk about themselves is different than the way that the Library of Congress categorizes them. So the Library of Congress has a subject heading of sexual assault victim. Many, many people within the community at UVA identify as survivors. Many don't, so it goes back and forth. But if we only had victim as a way of searching, all of the materials would be skewed. And so the practice of being able to modify that subject heading with community-generated tags allows us to more fully represent the stories that you then see when you search for something. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, can I add to that actually?
Yeah, please.
Well, first of all, you mentioned Chris Borg's work on algorithms. I also want to shout out Sophia Noble's work.
Yeah.
She's done amazing research on that. You can find a lot of her talks on it. She was looking specifically at how Black women are framed within Google search results. Another shout out to Chris Borg. She's at MIT, and they are actually one of, I think, my only known example of a library centering social justice within their library's mission and vision, which I think is incredible. They recently released that. You can look it up. To speak to Purdom's point of how metadata and the way we name things is so important, I want to give another example. Within the past couple of years, there's been a campaign to drop the I word from using the term undocumented immigrants as opposed to illegal immigrants in news reporting. That same discussion has been also happening within the library community because the Library of Congress subject heading is illegal immigrant. And so catalogers, the people who normally apply the subject headings to library materials, have been rallying around, let's change this to undocumented immigrant. So a couple weeks ago, one of our grad students who handles our social media, she was looking at our archive of LA Times photographs, and she commented to me, she's like, hey, I noticed that a lot of these photographs have the subject term illegal alien or illegal immigrant. Can we change that to undocumented? I was like, I know there's been this whole discussion. I'm not a cataloger. I'm not like super hip to what the outcomes have been, but let's touch base with our head of cataloging and metadata. So I talked to her, and she was very supportive. She's like, I totally understand why you want to do this. The Congress actually blocked us from doing it. There was, I guess, some sort of petition or motion to, officially change that in Library of Congress subject headings, but Congress blocked that. So we technically can't change it, and our head of cataloging was telling us, okay, here are the implications. We could add undocumented immigrant to the subject headings. It's not like an official one, so it's not going to get picked up in these larger catalogs like WorldCat. And we could leave illegal immigrant there, so it will get picked up, and people will be able to find the materials. But again, I think that's a really potent example of the importance of naming and metadata, and how racism is embedded in our systems of categorizing and trying to, provide access to these materials.
Well, on that cheerful note, I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions and discussion. And I think there's... Excellent.
My name is Cherish Kuma. I just have a question about your, when you mentioned Afrofuturism. I'm interested in Afrofuturism. More recently, I found out about Afrofuturism and surrealism at this program I was doing over the summer. But I approached it from a musical and literature and art lens, Octavia Butler, LaBelle, African Bambaataa, Aaron Douglas, but I want to know what lens did you approach it from, and what is your interest?
Yeah, same thing. Cherish, by the way, did you say your name? Hey. And the same thing. So the idea of Afrofuturism is embedded in the fact that most people, when they want to uncover the narratives of their greatness, look to the past. And the idea of Afrofuturism was that we cannot, right? One, that, talk about, being erased from the archive. We quite literally erased from the archives of U.S. citizenship and humanness, et cetera. And that there was not an imagined past, and that instead it was more important, and even if there had been, that the imagined past tended to recreate the same sort of social hierarchies, just shifting the power from either white men to black men, from a white nuclear family to a black nuclear family, but because we couldn't reimagine even just the basic foundations of a society without sort of embedding the colonizer's view of who and what we were, that reimagining some fictitious past was not sufficient, so that we needed to imagine a different future, and that's what Afrofuturism said, that the best of Black lives is probably in the future. I'm looking at it through the exact same thing, through literature and art. I mean, I'm probably more literature than anything else, But the same stuff, Netta Okafor, some of the more recent stuff I'm loving, and this has actually, I think, been part of my turn lately. I love so many of the African American, Native American, and indigenous scholars who are doing science fiction future writing right now. There's a huge community and growing. One of the things that sort of network scholarship has afforded me too, which is to meet people I think I never would have who are doing that work. And so reading them, and I think of them as a sociologist. So one of my colleagues, Kesia Ali, has this wonderful book that where she's looking at the sociological fictions in fiction writing, right? And it got me to thinking about the sociological underpinnings in the worlds that we imagine, which tons of people have done before. That part wasn't new. But I wanted to apply it to the ideas of how do we reimagine something like how money is going to work, how capital is going to work? Can we imagine a way a family could be organized in a way that does not reify sort of, the unpaid feminist labor divisions or the traditional divisions of labor? And if we couldn't even do it in our fiction, if we can't do it in our science fiction, then we can't do it in our politics. That's all Afrofuturism says, right? That if you can't even imagine it, then you can't organize around it. And so it's, trying to reimagine that even when we take away all of the anchoring points, and this is really just one of the things I tell my students is that when you think this way, you're just revisiting the basics of sort of theory construction, which is to uncover every assumption that you have about how the social world works by trying to imagine its opposite, right? And that's how you get at the assumptions that are embedded in things. And so it's given me a lens, to think about why do I take for granted that this would be how information capital would operate in a local community. Why would I assume that who would be taking this up is the mother, right? Why do I have these embedded assumptions that it's the mother who's the primary actor of socialization, right? Can I imagine something that does not center the unpaid labor of mothers in trying to build a sort of technological space for a community that does not for once work on the backs of black women who keep black institutions alive? Could I come up with that, which is actually funny considering I'm the black woman who's out there doing it, but I try is what I'm saying. So again, the exact same lens, saying that our fiction is our politics, and that gives us a lens to think about the political work that we do through our scholarship. Mm-hmm.
Can I add something to that? Last week, Purdom and I were at a conference, the Digital Library Federation Forum, and one of the keynote speaker was Rashida Phillips, who's a writer, an organizer, a lawyer in Philly. And one of the projects that she talked about that really struck me was the Oral Histories and Oral Futures project. So again, trying to imagine what the future can look like as a form of liberation. And one of the really amazing examples that she gave of the impact of doing the Oral Futures Project was they were trying to look at community history in this neighborhood that was getting gentrified. And so people shared their stories around affordable housing or not. And they shared that with the city council, and the city council then in turn dedicated lots of funds for lawyers for people who were getting evicted in that neighborhood. So I thought that was a really great connection between, an artistic, historical practice with actual policy changes.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I'm Mary Harper. I teach at a small rural college in Tifton, Georgia, and I kind of have a question. I'm going to figure it out as I go, but I know it was mentioned a couple of times, undergraduates, and how I don't specifically remember who was mentioning that, but I teach primarily freshman students. I teach first year composition. That's my thing. And I don't know, I'm new to this conference. This has been very helpful, just this one session for me. But what do you think, I don't know if I should ask for specific practices, but I've been trying to incorporate more, digital platforms in my classroom. Because I feel that it's important to I don't know if it's start early or go ahead and get them used to this, new education, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I just was wondering if y'all had any comments on, teaching freshmen.
Where are you into? What's the name of your institution?
Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College.
Thought I
ABAC.
might know because I was from Georgia and did some. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And about how large are usually your freshman comp classes?
My comp classes are capped at 25, and I
Okay.
teach 5.
All right. So those are the first questions we tend to ask. Like, where
Yeah.
are you? How many students you talking about? Okay.
Mhm.
But now I'll stop before I keep going.
So I think that there's I think one of the most impactful things we can do for our students is to tell them that they are researchers now, that they have expertise and creative skills now, not in some distant future. They don't have to finish their freshman year. Like day one, they have the capacity and the imagination to do really amazing work. And you have a great deal of power being at the sort of front of the room. You're the face of their experience at this moment. So who you cite, the kinds of writing that you point them to, the feedback that you give them, all of those things begin to plant seeds that they are able to be advocates for themselves, but more importantly, they're able to advocate for other people. And so if they see you creating a practice of citing, a wide variety of voices, people of color, which are often, less cited. And so if we sort of front that practice and don't mention it, just it's your practice, they begin to, you can expose how you work, right? But if you don't make it a big deal and you only cite women of color, they know that you can cite women of color, So I think that both the sort of tacit learning that happens, so they're socialized into being undergraduates, they're socialized into being scholars. And the ways that we, as mentors, can say, this is how we practice, I think is extraordinarily powerful.
Let me just say, so I think that of all the things that the DH community has done that I would hope for us to be able to mimic in digital sociology, but also across the university, is this. It is comprised of some of the most creative, critical, generous thinkers about pedagogy that I have ever experienced. I mean, of anything that you're going to find, I think copious materials on, and DH is going to be precisely answers to your question. So everything about reimagining how we teach, how we structure the classroom, how we do assignments, how we do grading, how we orient students to both their role in the university, but also as critical participants and co-creators of the university. I think certainly by no stretch of the imagination is that conversation perfect, but at least digital humanities has the conversation. Almost no other discipline does. So I say that to say you've got, I think, tons of resources and materials, and so much so that I'm probably just going to start by telling you to just go to the debates in digital humanities kind of thing and just start tracing the names from there for projects and things that people are working on. That's probably the most immediate practical advice. But you've got a great size class and opportunity to do it. First year composition is where, not first year composition, but in a composition course is where my blog was founded many, many years ago. The blog that is still part of my academic profession. It was in Collie Fulford's class, Collie sitting over there. So the opportunity, I think, of teaching people and providing the space that becomes whatever it's going to be for people is the most impactful at our frontline courses. I think that's true across all disciplines, by the way. Our intro, our one-on-ones, I mean, we know this empirically. They are the most important touchstones for the students, acculturation into both the college and into the discipline. It's where they learn the culture of college, and it is where they learn what they want to, how to articulate what they might want to do academically and professionally. So, and first year and composition courses also tend to have more flexibility with doing that. There tends to be less of an orthodox way of doing it, which I think allows some flexibility. But yeah, I just know so many people off the top of my head who are doing precisely that work and a ton of resources about how to do that. So handing over, making the class a collaborative one at the size of your classroom that is actually really, really possible. And I think I am generally stunned with what undergraduates come up with at that level when they are allowed the space to do it when it comes to digital stuff. Stunned. So I think that's it's a good space to be in.
I'll also say that there's probably about 50 people in this room right now who are saying, come to my session. That's exactly what we want to talk about. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jenny. I come from behalf of the Future Initiative program at the Graduate Center, and I'm a student at the City College of New York. I like when one of you guys said, we have to bring students to the conferences and break walls and separation between students and open doors and empower people around you. And I also heard seminar in the conversation, and I'm part of a seminar too, helping other students. I would like to ask you, how do you choose your students and how do you help them that first year? Because I have seen so much separation as an undergrad, and I help students, I push them because they have to find their way here, but how do you apply this into your seminar? How do you start the first step to help students in undergrad and give them that hope of, there's more out there. We can help you how to become better and, overcome, capitalism and on all these things that are under us, right? And that they don't know probably because they are first year students or second year. And I'm interested in knowing how you applying this into the seminars that you're doing.
And are you thinking more undergraduate or graduate?
Undergraduate.
Okay, because I do think it's a slightly different approach. Yeah. So the challenge at the undergraduate level is this. I asked the question of whether or not she was meant more undergraduate versus graduate because it is slightly different. So the undergraduate role is that we are responsible. There are some things that have to be done, right? You've got to know, in my discipline anyway, right? You've got to leave me knowing who Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are, and there's only so many ways I can tell you who that is, right? And I just say to them, listen, neither of us really want to do this, but you got to know so that we know, and this is the process, okay? And this is how we have a disciplinary conversation. But I think maybe your broader question was how do we bring them into not just the professional discourse, I think, but the sort of scholarly discourse, and how do we do that? So first and foremost is modeling the thing that we're trying to tell them to be. I don't know, so thinking about digital humanities or digital anything can't be an additive, right? We can't approach it the way we do intersectionality, which is we'll just keep adding things, and that somehow in the sum total of that, we're gonna get something that looks like, liberation or something. That's not really how it goes. It's an integrative process. So first and foremost, I think I don't know a way to be a good student teacher without first being reflexive and about who and what I am and what I'm bringing and modeling that for students. And I have yet to have an experience where doing that did not work for any classroom. Again, you can do it at different levels. I can do it in a more intimate way in a graduate seminar than I can in an undergraduate seminar, but I just don't know any other posture. I do not think you can be a teacher without first being a student, and I don't know any other way to have a learning posture without being in the student posture. And so students have to see me being a student, right? So if you ask me a question, I don't know. I'm a student just like you. We'll go figure it out. Let me show you how I learn. Right? I can show you that. So it means a vulnerability often in the classroom that I think, especially for today's undergraduate student, and I want to be clear here, we're probably mostly talking about a traditional undergraduate student population, which for many of us may not be the students that we're working with. If you're thinking more about non-traditional students, I think it's a slightly different conversation. But this part, I think, is universally true, that in our context, we cannot know anymore everything that we need to teach. Right? That's the first sort of power thing we've got to give up, I think, in a digitally mediated society. There is too much, and it is happening too fast. I cannot teach you those things. What I can teach you is how to be comfortable in the uncomfortable space of learning, because that's where you're going to have to live forever. the way we're going right now. So that means I will make mistakes in my classroom. You will watch me learn. You will watch me Google. You will watch me figure out search terms. You will watch me work backwards to a beginning. That means sometimes my plan for the day is upended, but that's all right. That's more important than whatever we were probably doing anyway. And that builds trust, I think, between people in a classroom. And honestly, nothing happens without trust. There is no learning process without social trust. And so the more you can establish and define and reinforce that, the better. But I think especially for traditional undergraduate students, and let me tell you why. The students that we are getting right now who are coming almost directly, either directly or almost directly from the K through 12 system, this is where my macro view is about to come in, and I apologize, are coming to us with an understanding of learning that has decentered, deprivileged, and sometimes negatively has penalized people for being in a student learning position, by which I mean being vulnerable. That's what student position is. So the very first thing you got to do to learn from somebody is admit that you don't know something. And you have to also assume that the other person might know something you don't know. And that is a vulnerable position for all of us. But we have made it institutionally a system of failure for you not to know something. And so I find that I spend the first half of any undergraduate seminar, by half, I don't mean the first half of the first day, I mean the first half of a semester, just over and over and over again, making it okay for people to fail. Because we cannot get anything done until they realize that they can do that safely in that space. They've got 12, 13 years of academic experience that teaches them that they are there to give me the right answer. And at college, of course, that's the exact wrong thing, right? We do not want that in a seminar. So building a social trust, building a place for them to fail, understanding the social location of where our students are coming from in this particular moment and how formal education works, and failing in front of them as much as possible. That's all I've got.
So I don't teach in traditional classrooms. So I work in the past several years, I've only worked at DH research centers. So the undergraduate students that I end up seeing tend to be already self-selecting into an interest of having some kind of digital question. But I think Tressie's comments stand true immediately. We used to show the XKCD cartoon for the 10,000. Mm-hmm. So he statistically breaks down how many people are learning something new for the first time each day, and it's 10,000 people. And traditionally, I've only worked, it's only this year that I'm starting to work with undergraduates. So my comments will come from sort of thinking about undergraduates, or thinking about graduate students who have sort of self-selected into being interested in the digital, whether they have experience or not. And often the way that I've taught is having small cohorts, 6 to 7 people, who come from different disciplines. And so we do a lot of sort of exposing our own spaces that we're not sure of, that we are co-learners, and that working on kind of finding a vocabulary that's shared so that we can collaborate, and showing and modeling that practice of learning something new, failing forward, but also learning in a playful way, which is an extraordinary luxury, and I know that. Because we're able to buy people's time out. I'm able to buy your time in a sense, so that you can be in a space that you can fail, right? And you're surrounded by people who are interested in your success. But I think the other piece of that is that it's really important to show excitement and enthusiasm about other people's work and make space for them to publish, whether that's initially on a blog or if that's helping edit something so then it's taken to a journal, and sort of exposing the process of what that means, and then citing people that are your co-collaborators. So when I was at the Scholars Lab, we did a lot of work on shared credit and project charters. And now at Myth, it's the same kind of conversation, though a slightly different structure of how do we make sure that if you are a contributor to a project that you have portable, meaningful credit that can be taken to the different spaces, because a sociologist is going to need something different than an English person versus someone who's a technologist. They need different things. And so within the shared piece, is it clear enough what your contributions are, and are we able to like map that to a meaningful credit to your department and so for your career, you know?
On the issue of citation, can I just say very quickly, that just brought to mind something that I cite my students in my lectures.
That's exactly right.
So that we know we're in a space. So, you know, they write something good in a paper or something, it's going to end up on the board, and we talk about, you know, and I cite them just like we, you know, cite everybody else. And I think it's about a way to signal how you get invited into a conversation, and that they're already there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so
Yeah.
I'll just add one short thing. I don't really work with students in the classroom at all. We hire graduate students to work in our program, so our methods of trying to engage them and mentor them look a little bit different. Some of the strategies that we use is allowing them to use work time for professional development. If there's something happening on campus that's relevant to their interests or career goals, then I'll be like, no, go ahead, take work time for that. That's totally related to your job. We also try to help demystify the academic search process, you know, for librarians and archivists. We do the whole same full day interview presentation. So I always invite students to come to the job talks with me, and then we talk about it afterwards. And, you know, of course, offering to look over their application materials, encouraging them to apply for things. I think a lot of them are like, oh, I don't have the right skill set yet, or I haven't taken this class, and I tell them, just apply for everything, especially when you're a student. Apply for all the fellowships to go to conferences. It's a great way to like get a feel for what's out there. So I really just try to, you know, encourage them to take advantage of all these opportunities and make the space for that in the workplace.
Yeah, that's so important.
All right, so of course it is 10 minutes now till our first set of sessions start, so we do have to come to a close. Thank you again to our amazing panelists.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And of course, if you don't know where you're going, feel free to ask someone in a yellow shirt or one of us, and have a great conference.
Not me.
If I can make a couple of comments before you go for clarity here. You're going to be scattering all over the place. If you have looked at the interactive schedule already, just something you may not have noticed, if you hold your device this way, you'll see the schedule sorted by rooms. If you